The maître d' at Bayview Harbor Club had my private line memorized, which was the first sign something was about to go very wrong for my family. "Miss Castellano," he said quietly into his phone, eyes fixed on the scene unfolding at the hostess stand. "I have a Richard Whitfield here demanding to speak to ownership." "He's telling your mother." "I'm sorry, is your mother Diane Whitfield?" "That a woman matching your description doesn't belong on the property." I was 3 docks away, coiling a line on my sailboat, salt drying on my forearms, the late afternoon light turning the water the color of hammered copper. I could hear Uncle Richard's voice carrying across the marina even without the phone. "She's embarrassing us in front of our guests," he was saying. "This is a members-only event. Get us someone in charge." My mother's voice, cool and certain, cut through. "Just remove her. She'll cause a scene otherwise." I set down the line, wiped my hands on a towel I kept looped through my belt for exactly this purpose, and walked toward the club my mother had spent 30 years telling me I'd never be good enough to set foot in. 2. Backstory. I grew up the daughter my mother apologized for. Not out loud. Diane Whitfield was too careful, too controlled, for outright cruelty in front of witnesses. Her disappointment lived in smaller, more surgical places. In the way she introduced my older brother Colton as our son, the attorney, at every dinner party, letting the sentence hang there like a trophy on a shelf, while I got folded into "and our other one." No title, no verb, just a category of leftover. In the way she signed me up for a community college accounting program the same week she flew to Boston and Providence to tour campuses with Colton, brochures fanned across the kitchen table like a hand of cards she was proud to hold. In the specific, quiet violence of her saying, when I was 22 and told her I wanted to work in hospitality management instead of finishing the degree she'd chosen for me. "Maya, some people are built for ambition. You're built for service work. There's no shame in knowing your ceiling." I believed her for exactly 4 more years. I want to be honest about that number, because it would be a better story if I'd never believed her at all, if I'd been born with some armor the rest of my family lacked. I wasn't. I absorbed it the way children absorb the temperature of a room, without deciding to, without noticing until much later how cold it had actually been. What changed it wasn't a single lightning bolt moment, though if you'd asked me at the time, I might have told you it was. It was a woman named Rosa Delgado, who ran housekeeping at the mid-tier hotel where I took my first job as a front desk clerk at 23. Rosa had immigrated from Ecuador at 19 with nothing. She told me once, matter of fact, no self-pity in it, that she'd arrived with $40 and a suitcase of clothes for a climate she hadn't understood was actually cold. By the time I met her, she owned 3 of the properties she'd once scrubbed floors in, quietly, through decades of decisions nobody around her noticed her making. She saw something in me that wasn't talent, she always said, but hunger, and she started teaching me, in stolen hours after closing shifts, the business behind the business. Not how to check guests inefficiently. How to read an occupancy report and see the story underneath it. How to spot a property that was failing 3 years before its books would admit it. How capital actually moves, who it moves toward, and why. "Your mother told you service work was your ceiling," Rosa said once, over bad coffee in a back office at 11 at night, ledgers spread between us. Service work is the floor. Everyone starts there, if they're smart. Whether you build up from it is an entirely different question, and it's not one your mother gets to answer for you. I built. At 26, I used 4 years of savings and a small loan Rosa co-signed against her own better judgment to buy a struggling 40-room in an hour outside the city, the kind of property everyone in the industry assumed was a slow-motion mistake, bleeding money in a location nobody wanted. I fixed the roof myself the first winter because I couldn't afford a crew, learned to patch shingles from videos at 2 in the morning, fell off a ladder once, and drove myself to urgent care rather than call anyone in my family. At 29, I owned 4 properties. At 31, I incorporated Whitfield Harbor Group, a holding company name I chose half as a private joke, half as something else I couldn't fully name even to myself, something about reclaiming a word my mother used like a membership badge. At 33, through the holding company, I quietly acquired Bayview Harbor Club, the exclusive marina and social club 2 hours from my mother's house, the one she and Uncle Richard had been trying to get accepted into for over a decade, the one that had rejected their membership application twice before I ever touched it. I told no one in my family any of this, partly because Rosa taught me the discipline of moving in silence. The moment people know what you have, they stop seeing you and start seeing what you're worth to them, and that math is never kind. But mostly because I'd learned, slowly and at real cost, that my mother's approval was not a thing I could earn by accumulating enough evidence. I'd spent my 20s trying report cards, then a promotion, then a marriage to a man she approved of loudly, and a divorce 3 years later that she blamed entirely on me, in front of my aunts, at a funeral, of all places. Nothing landed the way I needed it to. At some point you have to stop reaching for a hand that has never once, in your whole life, reached back the same way you offered it. So I let her believe I ran some kind of property thing. I let Colton make jokes about me playing landlord at Thanksgiving, laughing along in a way that cost me something small and specific every single time. I let it stay small in their minds, because for the first time in my life, it was mine, entirely mine, untouched by anyone's grading system but my own. 3. Secret success building. By 35, Bayview wasn't my only asset, but it was my favorite, the first significant acquisition I'd made without Rosa's signature backing it, purely on my own judgment, my own risk tolerance, my own read of a distressed property. I'd bought it from a family who'd run it into the ground through 3 generations of mismanagement and neglect, spent 2 years quietly renovating it board by board, rebuilt relationships with the members who'd drifted away, and turned it into the most sought-after club on that stretch of coast. Membership was capped now. The waitlist ran 3 years deep. People with real money and recognizable names got told, politely, to wait their turn. I kept a low profile deliberately, structurally. I wasn't listed on any public board roster. I owned entirely through the holding company, and the only 2 people who knew the actual chain of ownership were Rosa, long retired now but still the person I called first with any real decision, and Devin Okafor, my general manager, who'd been with me since the very first struggling in. Devin had started as a 19-year-old night clerk who caught a systemic billing error I'd missed in my 2nd month of ownership, and I'd promoted him steadily for a decade since. He ran daily operations, handled press, managed member relations with an easy warmth that made people trust the club before they trusted me, and he understood, without ever needing it spelled out twice, that my personal life stayed entirely separate from the professional one. Meanwhile, my actual life outside of all this kept moving the way lives do when you're not performing them for an audience. I'd started sailing again in my early 30s, badly at first, humiliatingly at first, on a small boat I kept at my own marina under a slip number instead of a nameplate. I was seeing someone, Elena Marsh, a marine biologist who ran a small coastal research nonprofit 2 towns over, whom I'd met because her organization had booked one of my smaller, less impressive properties for a fundraiser and had no idea the woman helping them troubleshoot a catering issue at midnight owned the place. We'd been together 2 years by the time of the dinner. She knew everything, the properties, the money, the whole architecture of what I'd built, and she was, without exception, the only person in my adult life who'd never once adjusted her treatment of me based on any of it. I'd also grown close, in a slower and stranger way, with a widowed sailing instructor named Frank Ruiz, 78 years old, who taught weekend lessons at Bayview and had no family of his own left living nearby. He'd started calling me kiddo within the first month of my taking lessons from him, the way I'd spent 35 years waiting for someone in my actual family to call me something that's simple and warm. I read too much noir fiction, kept a garden of tomatoes I was mediocre at growing, volunteered badly, and enthusiastically at a literacy program on Tuesday evenings. I was slowly, deliberately building a life that had absolutely nothing to do with proving anything to anyone who'd already decided who I was. My mother, meanwhile, had spent 3 years trying to get into the club I owned. I found out by accident. Devin mentioned it in passing during a routine call, no weight behind it at all. A Diane and Richard Whitfield had reapplied for membership for the 3rd time, and would I like to personally review the file this round, given the name? I sat with that for a long moment, phone against my ear, watching a heron work the shallows outside my window. Then I told him to process it normally, blind, the way every application got processed by committee, on the merits. I wasn't going to hand her something she hadn't earned the ordinary way, but I also wasn't going to sabotage her out of spite, dressed up as principal. That distinction felt important to hold on to. It still does. She got in on the third try, clean on the actual strength of the application. She had no idea whose signature sat 3 approval levels above the committee's. 4. Inciting incident. The invitation came through Colton, forwarded in a group text with no real context attached. Mom's hosting the Whitfield-Grayson merger dinner at her club Saturday. Families expected to attend and represent well. Wear something appropriate, Maya. I hadn't known Uncle Richard's construction firm was courting a partnership with Grayson Development, a mid-size regional player, ambitious, hungry, the kind of deal that would roughly double Richard's company's footprint if it landed. I also hadn't known my mother had offered her club, my club, as the venue, presumably because the address alone was meant to do half the persuading. I almost said no. Elena had a research trip scheduled that same weekend, tagging juvenile sharks off the coast, and I'd planned months earlier to go with her. But something about the phrase represent well sat wrong in my chest in a way I recognized immediately, the exact wrongness I'd swallowed at every family function since I was 14, the reminder that I existed at these events to be managed and minimized, not known. I texted back, "I'll be there." Devin called that evening, careful, professional. "Just so you're aware, the Whitfield party booked the private dining room for Saturday. Under your mother's name, through the standard reservation line. She has no idea it routes through us." "I know," I said. "Do you want me to flag it? Comp it, upgrade the room, put anything in place?" I thought about it longer than the question probably deserved. "No," I said finally. "Let it run exactly like any other reservation. I just want to be there, as myself." I didn't plan the confrontation. I want to be honest about that because it would be a cleaner story if I'd engineered the whole thing, walked in with a script. I hadn't. I'd simply decided, somewhere in the space between that text and Saturday, that I was done arriving early and dressing carefully and hoping, against 35 years of evidence, to finally be found acceptable. I was going to show up as I actually was, salt-cracked hands, a sailing tan, the clothes I genuinely wore on my own docks because for once in my life, it actually was my own dock. 5. Preparation. I spent Friday on the water instead of choosing an outfit, out past the breakwater with Frank, who'd asked, without much preamble, whether I was doing all right. I told him about the dinner. He listened the way he always did, without rushing to fix it, and said only, "Whatever they think of you tomorrow, kiddo, has got nothing to do with what's actually true. Just so you remember that going in." Elena, before she left for her research trip, sat on the edge of my bed while I packed for a very different kind of weekend and asked the question she always asked when my family came up, gently but without letting me dodge it. "Are you going to tell them this time?" "No," I said. "Maya, it's not about hiding anymore," I said, and I meant it mostly, even as I heard the small crack in my own certainty. "It's that I don't owe them the relief of an explanation. If they can't see me without a number attached to my name, that's not a gap I'm obligated to close for them." She didn't push, which was one of the things I loved most about her. She let me arrive at my own conclusions at my own pace, the precise opposite of everything I'd grown up with, where every conclusion about me had been reached by someone else first and handed to me finished. I called Rosa that night out of habit more than need. She was 71 now, mostly retired, living close to her grandchildren, her voice slower than it used to be, but no less exact. "You've built something real," she told me. "Whatever happened Saturday doesn't change what's already true. Go remember that. Not to prove it to them, just to remember it for yourself." I called Frank last, mostly to confirm he'd still be teaching the Saturday morning sailing class as usual, a small, ordinary continuity I wanted in place, proof that my real life would keep turning regardless of whatever happened at dinner. I arrived Saturday afternoon in deck shoes and a salt-faded linen shirt, hair still damp from an afternoon sail I hadn't bothered to cut short. Not a costume. Just Tuesday's version of myself, worn on a Saturday on purpose. 6. Confrontation. I saw them before they saw me. My mother in a cream dress by the hostess stand, posture immaculate. Uncle Richard mid-handshake with a silver-haired couple I assumed were the Graysons, Colton hovering a few feet off with the specific anxious posture he'd always gotten around Mom when he was trying to look important in front of people who mattered to her more than he did. My mother spotted me first, and her face performed the recalibration I'd watched it do my whole life. Fast, practiced, a kind of trio, doing rapid math on exactly how much damage I represented to the evening. "Maya," she said, low, pulling me half a step aside from the Grayson's earshot, her hand closing around my elbow like she could physically redirect me out a side door. "You couldn't have worn something more presentable? This is important." "I sailed over," I said. "Didn't think to bring a cocktail dress on a 14-footer. Uncle Richard turned, saw me, and his jaw tightened the way it always did around me. Less pure anger, I'd come to understand over the years of watching him, than a discomfort he'd never once examined closely enough to name. Richard had grown up the family's other disappointment, a full decade before me. The brother who chose construction over the law degree his father had already picked out for him. He'd spent 30 years building a company to prove himself to a man who died still unsatisfied, and somewhere in that long, grinding effort he'd absorbed the family's rules about who counted and who didn't, and applied them to me automatically, without ever once questioning where the rules had originated. It didn't excuse him. But watching his face that evening, I understood him a little better than I had in years. A man still trying to earn a dead man's approval, taking it out on the one relative even less credentialed than he'd been. "This is a private event," he said to me, not quite meeting my eyes. "For the Graysons. Family only, and He stopped, visibly searching for a word that wasn't outright cruel, and failing to locate one. "You're not exactly dressed for this." "I am family," I said evenly. "You're an embarrassment tonight, specifically," my mother said, quiet and sharp, glancing toward the Graysons to make sure they hadn't overheard yet, "and I need you to leave before they start asking questions we don't want to answer." That was the line. Not the cruelest thing she'd ever said to me. Not remotely close, if I'm being honest about the inventory, but the tiredest. 35 years of being a problem to be contained rather than a daughter to be known, distilled down into 9 flat words at a hostess stand on an ordinary Saturday. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I stepped back the way I had 1,000 times before across 1,000 smaller humiliations, and I watched Richard flag down the host, a young man I recognized as Devon's newest hire, whose name I was momentarily blanking on. "Get us the owner right now," Richard said, voice rising enough that the Graysons' heads turned. "She's embarrassing us in front of our guests." My mother nodded, composed, final, already rehearsing the apology she'd give the Graysons for the inconvenience. "Just remove her. She'll cause a scene otherwise." I smiled, genuinely, which surprised even me in the moment, and said nothing at all. The young host looked between Richard and me with visible confusion, then pulled out his phone, stepping a few feet away for what he clearly assumed was a routine call to management. I watched his expression shift in real time, confusion, then alarm, then something almost giddy with the specific thrill of watching a hierarchy invert itself in front of him. Devon arrived within 90 seconds. He must have already been on property, doing his usual Saturday rounds. He crossed the room directly toward me, hand extended, voice pitched precisely to carry to everyone within 15 feet. "Ms. Castellano, we weren't expecting you until Saturday's board walkthrough next week. Is everything all right with a private dining room? Should we prep your usual dock for this evening, or would you prefer we hold the Whitfield reservation exactly as booked?" The room didn't go silent so much as collapse inward, all the ambient noise of the club narrowing down to our small, suddenly very exposed cluster. My mother's face, when a shade of pale, I had genuinely never seen on her before in 35 years, a color reserved, I understood watching it happen, for the specific horror of discovering she'd been wrong about something structural, something load-bearing in her entire understanding of the world's order. "Ms. Castellano?" Richard repeated, and I watched 3 decades of easy, automatic dismissal try and fail to reconcile itself against the words "your usual doc." "It's my mother's maiden name," I said quietly, to Devon, though the words were really meant for everyone standing there. "I've used it for the business since the beginning. Keep the Whitfield reservation exactly as booked, Devon. They're guests tonight, same as anyone." Mrs. Grayson, sharp-eyed, clearly the more perceptive half of the couple Richard had been courting for months, set down her wine glass with a small, deliberate click against the table. "I'm sorry," she said slowly, looking between my mother and me. "You're telling me this is your club?" "I own the holding company that owns it, yes," I said. "And you're—" Mr. Grayson looked at Richard, visibly recalculating something in his own head. "You're his niece," I confirmed. "I run several hospitality properties along the coast. Bayview's my favorite of them, honestly." Colton, silent through the entire exchange, finally said the only fully honest thing anyone in my family managed that night. "I didn't know." "No," I agreed, not unkindly. "You didn't." My mother reached for something to say and found, for what might have been the first time in her adult life, absolutely nothing at all. 7 immediate consequences. The Graysons left within the hour. Not out of malice. Mrs. Grayson was, if anything, unexpectedly gracious to me on her way out, even slipping me a card and saying she'd love to talk hospitality investment sometime, entirely separate from whatever this was. But the meeting's actual purpose had evaporated the moment the room's power dynamics rearranged themselves in front of everyone. It's difficult to negotiate a partnership with a man who just tried to have his own niece forcibly removed from a club she secretly owns. Richard understood this before anyone had to spell it out for him. I watched the calculation cross his face, the same cold, practical one he must have run 1,000 times building his company from nothing. "This deal is dead. Contain the bleeding. Get out clean." He didn't apologize to me that night. I want to be honest about that too, because it would be a tidier story if he had. He left quickly, quietly, without a word to me at all, and I heard through Colton weeks later that the Grayson partnership never materialized. Not directly because of me, but because word travels fast in small regional industries, and the Whitfields tried to have a family member removed from a club she secretly owns, is exactly the kind of story that follows a man into his next negotiation. My mother stayed behind after everyone else had gone. She sat at the emptied table for a long time, staring at the tablecloth, and when she finally looked up at me, she didn't apologize either. She asked, instead, the question that told me everything about the last 35 years in a single sentence. "How long have you had this?" Not "why didn't you tell me?" Not "I'm sorry." Just an accounting. How large is the thing I misjudged, exactly, and what does that mean about all my other calculations? 6 years, I said. This club specifically. Longer for the company as a whole. She nodded slowly, and I watched her run the math I recognized instantly from childhood, recalculating my worth against a bigger number, the same way she always had, just with more zeros attached this time. "You could have told us," she said finally. "You could have asked who I was at any point in 35 years, I said, without heat, just fact. Not what I'd built. Who I actually was underneath any of it. You never once did." I didn't gain anything by saying it out loud. Her face didn't crack open with sudden realization, didn't soften into the movie scene understanding I might once have fantasized about at 22. She simply looked tired and old, in a way I genuinely never let myself see before, and for one unwelcome second, standing in that empty dining room, I felt something that wasn't triumph at all. It was grief, plain and unglamorous, for the mother I'd never actually had and clearly, even now, still wouldn't get. 8. Resolution/epilogue. I didn't cut my family off entirely. I want to be honest about that, because the clean version of this story ends with slammed doors and a righteous walk into a sunset, and that isn't what actually happened. Colton reached out a few weeks later, awkward and unpracticed in a way I found more convincing than any polished apology would have been, and asked if he could come see the properties sometime. Not for status, he said, just because he genuinely wanted to know me, actually know me, after 30-some years of not bothering. I said yes. We're rebuilding something small and slow between us now, checking in most weeks, and it might not become much in the end, but it's honest, which is already more than we'd ever had before. My mother and I speak occasionally, not often. She's never apologized in the specific words I once would have needed from her. What she has done once was show up unannounced at Bayview on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, find me on the docks in my actual work clothes, tool belt and all, and simply watched me work for 20 minutes, without saying anything. "You're good at this," she said eventually, when I finally looked over. It wasn't an apology. It also wasn't nothing, and I've decided to let it be exactly what it was instead of demanding it become more. I went home that night, after the dinner, and sat alone on my own boat in the dark for a long time before I called Elena, hundreds of miles away on her research trip. Not to celebrate, I didn't feel like celebrating, not really. I felt the specific, unglamorous loneliness of finally being seen by people who still, underneath the shock, mostly saw a number where a person should have been. Rosa had warned me once that the reveal never lands the way you imagine it will beforehand, that the fantasy is watching them regret everything, and the reality is just watching them recalculate, coldly, efficiently, the same way they always have. She was right, as she usually was. I sat with that for a long while before the grief finally settled into something quieter, something I could actually carry forward instead of just around. Bayview is still my favorite property, still the one I visit most, still the one that feels most like proof of something rather than just an asset on a spreadsheet. Frank still teaches sailing every Saturday morning, still calls me kiddo, still has no idea how much that word has meant to me over the years. Elena and I are still exactly ourselves with each other, unimpressed and unbothered by any of this, which remains the single steadiest thing in my life. Devin still runs the front of house better than I ever could, still knows exactly when to step in and when to let things play out. My family knows who I am now, mostly, in the ways that matter and several that don't. It didn't fix what was actually broken between us. It just meant that whatever comes next will happen with the truth sitting on the table between us instead of buried underneath it, which is, I've come to understand, the most any of us can honestly ask for. If you've ever built something quietly because you'd stopped believing anyone would notice it otherwise, I'd genuinely like to hear how that went for you. Tell me in the comments.